in your hymnal number 19, Heavenly Sunlight. No soul, walk in sunlight on my journey, over the mountains to the vale. Jesus has said, I'll never forsake thee, promising life that never can fail. Heavenly sunlight, flooding my soul with glory divine. Be dismissed to class.
Good morning. Okay, a few of you are awake. Always good. Numbers chapter 16 is where we are. Numbers chapter 16, we'll be picking up there. We set, I hope, some good foundation last Sunday regarding Korah and those who were with him, Dathan, Abiram, those 250 people who were all leaders, representative of more people, of course. And this common problem we see with Israel. We began with murmuring earlier on in Numbers and how serious God took that. Moses' struggles, which was his lament before God, his crying out before God. He wasn't murmuring in the way that they were about God's provisions, but it was very difficult for him with his people. At one point earlier on, you remember, what did Moses ask God to do to him or for him? It was, just take my life. I can't handle this anymore. And God says no. God has threatened on occasion to just wipe out Israel and start all over again. And who is it that comes to him and begs him not to do that? Moses. So as difficult as it was for Moses, he comes and offers intercession, which is a very important theme in the book of Numbers, which also foreshadows Christ, that's right, and his priesthood. So we've seen a lot of that. We've seen even the organization of the initial organization of the camp and all of that and the tabernacle. All of those things are foreshadowing some blessings we enjoy right now. So it's important as we read through Numbers, and we've mentioned this before, but I just think if we can keep this in our mind, that this isn't just a story from the past that somehow doesn't apply. We know Old Testament scripture and those narratives, those stories have principles involved in who God is, who God's people should be, and they foreshadow what we have in Christ. And if we can really draw that out of the text and see that in the text, that'll be very profitable, be very beneficial to us. So as we come to this particular event, probably one of the more well-known from the book of Numbers, again, nothing new. Who was it in that immediate leadership that actually was punished for her murmuring before this? Yeah, even Miriam. Now, it was temporary, but there was judgment involved. So even within the leadership, there was some of this. We certainly see it from the people complaining. What about their past deliverance that God had offered them? And we're going to see more of this today. What do they do with that? Because it seems like if you're really thankful for what God has done, that you wouldn't be acting in a rebellious and murmuring and complaining way. So obviously something's wrong here. What was Israel saying about that past deliverance? Yeah, Egypt, prison became paradise, and they start talking about it being a land flowing with milk and honey. Now, they were slaves, and they were dying, and they were suffering, and all of that, and God redeemed them. He delivered them from all of that. He had promised them a land flowing with milk and honey. Now, is this journey easy? No. Was God providing? Yes. Should they have remembered what God had done for them? Absolutely. Do we fall into that same kind of trap today? Sure we do. So again, you see that cycle of complaining and murmuring. And what does God describe this murmuring and complaining as? What does he say it is? Because sometimes we probably wouldn't put it in this category. What does he say they're guilty of when they're complaining and murmuring and all that? Remember? He says it is unbelief. He says it's unbelief. So sometimes we have the idea, only the atheist is an unbeliever. Well, not according to Scripture. It's unbelief, not because they're saying there's no God, but because they are dissatisfied with God's provisions. It's distrust. So unbelief is really distrust, a lack of trust in God. He says it's evil. You have an evil heart that has led you to this. So it is a heart issue. So it's not just a matter of not saying this or not feeling this way or thinking this way. It's a matter of my heart and having a heart for God. Darryl, what were you going to say?
Chapter opens, it's likely that close to 20 years have passed. Mm-hmm. So it seems like this is stacked right on top of the events of the previous chapter, but it's not. So there's been a 20-year period, maybe of relative peace and calm, mm-hmm. and then this crops up.
Right, which, you think about that, the cycle that does continue to be a pattern, even if years pass. And we can see that among God's people today. You can have blessing and calmness, and then it seems like these bad attitudes just crop right back up. And so let's get back into, I just want to review a little bit from what we covered last time in our discussion. So Korah is coming in. You'll notice there it mentions the 250 leaders of the congregation chosen in the assembly. And they were men of what? What kind of men were they in verse 2? Men of renown. Yeah, this isn't a bunch of nobodies coming in. I mean, these are men that have leadership of their own. And Korah was part of the Levites. You remember we looked at we were talking about the Levites, and you had the Kohathites, and you had the Reubenites and all that. But the Levites had an important role. Now, were they in the role of the actual priesthood, the way Aaron and his sons would be? No. But were they involved in handling holy, instruments and things like that? Yes, they were. But they wanted more. And it's interesting, we talked about this last time, but if you'll notice verse 3, they assembled together against Moses and Aaron. Now, if you assemble together against Moses and Aaron, who are you really assembling against? God. Now, they don't look at it that way. But it goes on to say, you have gone far enough. I'm reading from the New American Standard Version. And of course, later on, Moses is going to say to them, so they're saying to Moses, you've taken enough. You've taken authority that doesn't belong to you when actually it did belong to him. And so they say, you've done enough. You've gone far enough. We need to change this whole situation. And Moses comes back and feeds their language right back to them and says, no, you've gone far enough. And he's going to let God discern this particular situation. Moses falls on his face in verse 4. You'll notice in verse 7, he says, "You've gone far enough, you sons of Levi." Verse 8, then Moses said to Korah, "Hear now, you sons of Levi, is it not enough for you that the God of Israel has separated you from the rest of the congregation of Israel, to bring you near to himself, to do the service of the tabernacle of the Lord, and to stand before the congregation to minister to them?" I mean, what a privilege that is. But that's not enough. You want more. He goes on to say in verse 10, and he has brought you near, Korah, and all your brothers, sons of Levi, with you. And are you seeking for the priesthood also? So God's blessed you, but that's not enough for you. You want more. You know, when you think about the difference in what Jesus does for us and what Satan's agenda is, this is really rather satanic. That is very self-absorbed. I want my way. I've got to have more. And we live in a society like that. We live in a culture like that. And he goes on to say in verse 11, "Therefore you and all your company are gathered together." And this is interesting because it says they were gathered against Moses and Aaron, but he says, and he gets it right. He cuts through all that and he says, "You're gathered together against Yahweh," or against the Lord. "But as for Aaron, who is he that you grumble against him?" Why are you doing this against Aaron? Then Moses sent a summon to Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, but they said, "We will not come up." So this is just childish rebellion. Here Moses is, and he says, "You need to come over here." And they said, "No, we're going to stay right here. Thank you very much. We're going to stay right here." So they're in rebellion. In other words, we're not recognizing any authority for you to send for us. And so as you continue to read the text, this just seems like a downward spiral, and they say, "We will not come up." Verse 13, "Is it not enough that you have brought us up out of a land of flowing with milk and honey to have us die in the wilderness, but you would also lord it over us?" Let's talk just a little bit about that. We mentioned that last time. I want you to notice this last point on this slide. And it's really true of any of us. So when you have pride and you have jealousy and you have selfishness and it enters into our thinking, what often happens is it develops because now I have wrong motives, but I convince myself I actually have the right motives. And then it doesn't matter about what somebody else is really saying, because I have an agenda, I have a framework I'm filtering everything through. So the narrative or the truth of what's happened gets completely turned on its head. So, were I to tell the story, it's all going to be completely biased. It's going to be completely prejudiced. I'm going to leave important information out. I'm not going to recognize the truth. And so what's happening, we read this and we think, boy, what a terrible person Korah is right now. But it can happen to any of us. And so when you really think about it, his true motive is selfishness and jealousy and envy. But do you think Korah recognized that about himself? No. Who's the enemy now? Moses, who's in authority, who actually should be in authority. Okay. So you get this whole false framework, and the way he's telling the story, back when they were in Egypt, and it certainly was not a land flowing with milk and honey, but see how they've reversed everything? So the land God's promised is a land flowing with milk and honey. You had a generation that didn't trust God in accomplishing that. And so now here's Korah, and they're saying, it's not enough that you took us from. Let's go back to Egypt. Let's go back to the land flowing with milk and honey, which really isn't a land flowing with milk and honey. It's captivity, and it's slavery, and it's a prison. And let's turn this story around. Why turn the story around? Well, let's turn the story around so I can get my way. Because I don't like what you're doing here, and I want a different way. So you see all of that coming out there, I think, in verse 13, he says, "Indeed, you have not brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey." Well, they're not there yet because of their unbelief. That wasn't Moses' fault. That was their fault. "Nor have you given us an inheritance of fields and vineyards." Well, there's an inheritance of fields and vineyards right over there in Canaan, and they have gotten right up to the precipice. And their unbelief, this is the interesting thing, how they turn things. The very attitude they have right now is why they're not in the land of inheritance with fields and vineyards. It's not Moses. At this point, it's certainly not. Verse 15, "Then Moses became very angry and said to the Lord, 'Do not regard their offering. I have not taken a single donkey from them, nor have I done harm to any of them.'" What's going on here with Moses? Why do you think he says that? About the donkey. I'm not taking a donkey from them. Why do you think he says that? Kelton, go ahead.
Is he upset, but he's saying, "I haven't done anything wrong to them," it seems.
Yeah.
So he would know, I think that God knows that. And it seems to show his humanity, that he's really feeling the hurt of what's being thrown at him.
So Moses, go back to when Moses was, remember when Moses gave the excuses but didn't feel like he was a qualified speaker and all this. So, and we have these passages about his humility, how meek he was. And so he's done nothing but try to help them, even to great trauma emotionally. I think he's been completely self-sacrificial, which, by the way, again, foreshadows Christ in many ways. And this is the treatment. Now, isn't it interesting when you come to Christ who comes on the scene, this is the same kind of treatment he gets from Israel too. It's a rebellious bitterness, and the Jewish leadership had the same concerns toward Christ that Korah and Dathan and Abiram have against Moses. They wanted to hang on to their authority. So it's like this cycle, and you see it get replayed. And so here they are, they're saying all this to Moses. If you go, I think it's Samuel, there's a couple of times in the Old Testament where a prophet will come before God and Israel will be acting this way, and they'll say, "I haven't taken one thing from them." And Paul does something similar. I mean, if you look at 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, or maybe it's 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, where he talks about the fact that, he's cared for them, he's nurtured them, even as a mother would her children. He's not taken anything from them. He's not used this as some kind of cloak for covetousness. And so I think you do see Moses' humanity, and he's saying to God, don't listen to them. And of course, I think in the back of his mind, he had to know that God wasn't going to. But there is that sense of being falsely accused. What's your normal human response to say, well, wait a minute, let's look at the record here. I haven't taken one thing from them. All I have done is given. Okay, so that's the kind of the situation here, and God knows that, of course. Go ahead.
Pattern for people in leadership, whether they are a leader over a town or a larger region or a country, is that they compensate themselves and they live well. And I think another aspect of this is Moses is saying, I haven't compensated myself and taken things that normally would be due to a person who needs this.
Let me repeat that, Taryn, so I know some of you probably didn't hear what Taryn said. Taryn was saying normally, and I think it's a good point, if you have a leader of a nation especially, they tend to do quite well and are compensated quite well. And also Moses is saying he hasn't done that. He's not doing this for what he can get out of it. In other words, I'm not taking things from them. I'm not being selfish. They've got everything backwards. And so there is a time, the lesson I think here is there is a time when it's right to defend your integrity when it comes to defending God's character. See, if it's just about me, you can absorb some things, but really to say these things about Moses, remember, is to say it about the Lord at the end of the day. And so it's not that Moses is saying, oh, let me just defend myself. I think Moses is saying, this isn't true. So he needed to defend his integrity, much the way Paul would his apostleship. You know, if you read 2 Corinthians and he was being undermined and attacked regarding his apostleship, and he says, I don't really want to do this. I mean, this is folly to me, but I have to because you put me in this situation. So Moses comes back and says, you know, none of that is true. So they're resisting Moses' leadership. He calls on God for vindication. He defends his integrity in chapter 16 and verse 15. And so now he's going to turn his attention back to Korah, and he's going to say, okay, let's get this straightened out. And he tells Korah, he instructs him that he and the 250 gathered with him are to bring an incense offering the next day. So let's read chapter 16, and let's go ahead and read chapter 16 and verses 16 through 19. Bo, if you would. Chapter 16, verses 16 through 19.
And Moses said to Korah, tomorrow you and all your company be present before the Lord, you and they as well as Aaron. But each take his censer and put incense in it, and each of you bring a censer before the Lord, 250 censers, both you and Aaron each with a censer. So every man took a censer, put fire in it, laid incense on it, and stood at the door of the tabernacle meeting with Moses and Aaron. And Korah gathered all the congregation against him at the door of the tabernacle meeting. Then the glory of the Lord appeared to all the congregation.
Okay. So Korah gathers all his followers against Moses and Aaron, and he seems like he's quite confident about this. I mean, you know, if you tell, you have a false account of things or a false narrative or whatever, you can't tell it so long. You really start to believe the thing you're saying, even though that's not the case. And so they're all going to appear here, and God is going to judge about this. And of course, his confidence is going to be shattered pretty quickly, very soon. And this rebellion is going to be judged as that text would indicate. Now, this idea of the tent of meeting, we've talked a lot about in the book of Numbers. So you're dealing with a place of holy worship and sacrifice. You're dealing with God's presence, and often at these important junctures and events, remember, God will tell Moses to meet him, or Moses and Aaron to meet him at the tent of meeting. And so we've talked a lot about this, but I think you see the emphasis here. Things get really serious here, and God is going to step in and say, I'll take care of this. He's not going to tell Moses, you go take care of this now. I'll take care of this rebellion, because ultimately, as we've already mentioned, the rebellion was against the Lord. And so it says that his glory appeared, and we could spend a lot of time, and we won't this morning, but when you think of God's glory, that word is sometimes hard to define. Really, it could represent all of his attributes. Sometimes it represents just his holiness or his judgment or his, when you think of holiness, you think of separateness from us. But glory is his manifestation of himself. Now, there are manifestations of God's glory that you see, and sometimes the Bible will speak of God in a sense that, you know, God is there, and he is, in that it's before his view. It's not that he's left the glory of heaven and come down here, but it's everything is before his view. And so his presence is there, his power is there. This is all an assault on all of God's glory, whether they realize that or they do not. And so what he's going to tell, and I want you to look at chapter 16, verse 21. He's going to say, before this judgment is poured out, and we're going to talk a little bit about this, there's this sin, there's this rebellion, and what is he going to tell, I know it's on the chart, but what is he going to tell Moses and Aaron to do? Separate. Moses has pled and pled and pled. Moses has offered intercession. So it's not that this is just some random arbitrary kind of thing. But at this point, remember when we talked about previously there are sins that there were sacrifices for, where maybe it's an occasional sin or a rash sin or even a sin out of weakness in some way. But then there's like deliberate, high-handed, just I don't care, rebellious apostasy, sin. And that's what we're dealing with here. And so God says, and they're still hanging on to this. I mean, they're willing to go to this test. And God says, separate yourself. So notice there, you have that in verse 21. Let's look at verse 24, 26, and 45 to get the emphasis. So in verse 21, separate yourselves from among this congregation that I may consume them instantly. Then in verse 24, speak to the congregation saying, get back from around the dwellings of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Then if we go further and we look at verse 45, let me turn the page here, but if we come to verse 45, the scripture, Moses said to Aaron, take your censer and put in it fire from the altar and lay incense on it. Then bring it quickly to the congregation and make atonement for them, for wrath has gone forth from the Lord, the plague has begun. We'll come back to that in just a little while. When you see this principle, there are those who want to say, that's an Old Testament God, and we have a New Testament God. Problem is, the Bible nowhere teaches that. Now, are there aspects of God's nature that seem to be highlighted and emphasized a great deal in the Old Testament that we also see in the New Testament, but there seems to be a lot more emphasis on it? Sure. Is there an aspect of God's mercy and grace and love because Jesus has come and God became flesh and dwelt among us and is bringing redemption and salvation and all that? Yeah, sure. But that doesn't mean that I can go and say, well, God really does, He's not capable of bringing this kind of judgment at the end of time. It doesn't mean I can say God never judges anybody. Because even the New Testament talks about this. It talks about the goodness of God. It talks about the severity of God's judgment. Is God loving in the book of Numbers? Yes. Look at all the provisions that He has made. Look at all the mercy He has shown. Look at how many times Moses, even if Moses said, hey, just for your sake, don't do this. And he listened to Moses. And so we've seen mercy even in a book that often is about judgment. But I think this is vital for us to see. There is a time when, for the sake of God's name and the sake of God's holiness, even though this may not fit with our cultural thinking right now, that God's people must separate themselves from those who are in high-handed rebellion to the Lord. Now, this kind of thing, isn't happening. He's not swallowing people up of the earth right now. But is there a sense in which when we come to the New Testament from a spiritual standpoint that the Bible will speak in 1 Corinthians 5, for instance, about a man that was just not listening to any warnings and he was living with his father's wife and they needed to separate themselves? Sure. Does the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 6 and 7 not talk about come out from among them and be separate, be holy? Sure. Now you could take that to an extreme that doesn't fit with the whole of Scripture, but you have to take what the Scripture says too. Right. So when we come back to this and we're reading this, I would encourage us, we thank God for Jesus because really we all deserve God's judgment. But on the other hand, allow that to help shape our understanding of who God is, even if it makes us uncomfortable. And realize that His wisdom and His goodness and His love and His righteousness and holiness are perfect. So when we come back to Numbers chapter 16, and he says, I want you to separate from them. Now notice verse 22, but they fell on their faces and said, Oh God, God of the spirits of all flesh, when one man sins, will you be angry with the entire congregation? So maybe not everybody's doing this. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the congregation, saying, get back from around the dwellings of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And then Moses arose and went to Dathan and Abiram with the elders of Israel following him. And he spoke to the congregation, saying, depart now from the tent of these wicked men and touch nothing that belongs to them, or you will be swept away in all their sin. So they got back from around the dwellings of Korah, Dathan and Abiram, and Dathan and Abiram came out and stood at the doorway of their tents, along with their wives and their sons and their little ones. And Moses said, "By this you shall know that the Lord has sent me to do all these deeds, for this is not my doing. If these men die the death of all men, or if they suffer the fate of all men, then the Lord has not sent me." So not only does he say, if they stay alive, he says even if they die, but it looks like it could be a kind of normal, natural occurrence or just an everyday judgment of some kind. He says, then you know that I'm not telling you the truth. So he's actually raising the bar to say this is going to be clear to the whole congregation what's happening here. In verse 29 or 30, but if the Lord brings about an entirely new thing, and the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that is theirs, and they descend alive into Sheol, then you will understand these men have spurned who? The Lord. Moses never makes this about Moses, really. And so as we move through some of this, I want you, there's a couple of factors, because some of these men were in two different locations. So Korah camps among the Levites, Dathan and Abiram camped among the Reubenites. But I think that the narrator's challenge is to show all these men are going to be judged. You can't run away from God. You can't get away from God. They've all acted in this way. Now let's go further. When you look at chapter 16 and verses 23 through 40, the story's going to alternate between complaints about Moses' leadership and the criticism of the priestly activities being restricted to Aaron and his family. And so he says, look, I just mentioned to you, this is going to be unique. In fact, it's so unique, but Moses tells them what's about to happen. So it's not like he just leaves it open. He tells them exactly what's about to happen. And so as he's telling them in verses 28 through 31, here we come to the judgment. So verse 28 through 31 we just read, he says they've spurned the Lord. I think it's important to remind ourselves of all that's happened up to this point with Israel. How many times God has beseeched them. How many times they've rebelled. How many times they've murmured and complained. And even if this is several years later, still, from a historical standpoint, it's within a very short period of time. So let's read now verse 31. As he finished speaking all these words, the ground that was under them split open, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up and their households, and all the men who belonged to Korah with their possessions. So they and all that belonged to them went down alive to Sheol, and the earth closed over them, and they perished from the midst of the assembly. And all Israel who were around them fled at their outcry, for they said, the earth may swallow us up. Can you think about a time in the New Testament? It's not quite the same, but when God poured judgment out directly on some people that were guilty of rebellion against him? Yeah, and Ananias and Sapphira, and how that impacted other people. Well, it's going to be interesting how, you think at this point, okay, the earth just swallowed these people up. At that point, and certainly they're afraid that this is going to happen to them. So then it says in verse 35, fire also came forth from the Lord and consumed the 250 men who were offering the incense. Remember, he told them to bring the censers, and they're going to offer incense, and they're going to engage in worship, and we're going to find out what's going to happen. And so you had those immediate folks who get swallowed up of the earth. Then you're going to have fire come upon those who were in rebellion to God. And this is even going to me, it gets even more interesting. What does the Lord tell Moses to tell Aaron to do? Well, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, say to Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, what does he tell him to do? Because you're going to have ashes here. This fire has consumed these people. And what's going to be left there, and what are they supposed to do? What'd you say? Get the censers. Why? Yeah, the censers are holy. They weren't. Okay, let that kind of sink in. They weren't holy. They were misusing the censers because they didn't have a right to be doing this. But the censers were holy. So you can try to be involved in the work of God, but if you and your character are being rebellious to God, God's displeased. And he can pour judgment out on you. And that's an important lesson. Daryl, were you going to say something? Okay.
There's fire, and they go out into that, and they gather the men are burned. Apparently the censers are laying there, and they go into that mess and start picking up the censers.
It would have been gruesome, I would think. By the way, and I meant to do this, and I just failed to do it. And maybe I'll do it first study next week. I know it's exactly the kind of chart you want to see. There's been a lot of death. If you go back a few chapters, there's been some death in Israel. And some judgment. So at some point you would think, okay, we get the point. But they seem to be stubborn in some ways in their rebellion, at least some of them. I'm not saying all of them, but some of them regarding Moses. So let's keep reading here. So he says to Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, that he shall take up the censers out of the midst of the blaze, for they are holy, and you scatter the burning coals abroad. As for the censers of these men who have sinned at the cost of their lives, let them be made into hammered sheets for a plating of the altar, since they did present them before the Lord, and they are holy, and they shall be for a sign to the sons of Israel. So God says, I want you to remember this. This is what you're going to do with them. And remember what happens when people rebel against me in this way. And they bought into their own lies. They bought into their own deceit because of their own arrogance. And this is what happens. So you're thinking at this point, okay, they're going to get this. So Eleazar, and I want you to think about this. Eleazar, the priest, took the bronze censers with the men who were burned that they had offered, and they hammered them out as a plating for the altar, as a reminder to the sons of Israel that no layman who is not of the descendants of Aaron should come near to burn incense before the Lord, so that he will not become like Korah in his company, just as the Lord had spoken to him through Moses. And I know I've mentioned this to you, but I'm going to mention it again. This is, and I know we use this as an illustration, but it's very biblical and it's something we need to get. This goes to show us again how we discern God's will. And when God says this is who is to be involved in this, nobody else, he doesn't have to say you can't, you can't, you can't, you can't, you can't. That's just not how communication works. And so he has specified, he has given his pattern. That needs to be absolutely respected. And he tells, going further, I want you to see, we've got a little bit of time here, I want you to see what happens, and it just shows you the power of the deception of sin. Look at verse 41. Let's read verses 41. I want to read 41 through 50, verses 41 through 50. Hang on, Taryn, go ahead. Yeah, that is a good point. Right. Story. Yeah. Yeah, that is. That's a good point. And there had to be a reshaping, too. That's interesting. Okay, 41, Richard, if you could, verses 41 through 50.
On the next day, all the congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron, saying, "You have killed the people of the Lord." Now it happened, when the congregation had gathered against Moses and Aaron, that they turned toward the tabernacle of meeting. And suddenly the cloud covered it, and the glory of God appeared. Then Moses and Aaron came before the tabernacle of meeting, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Get away from among this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment." And they fell on their faces. So Moses said to Aaron, "Take a censer and put fire in it from the altar. Put incense on it, and take it quickly to the congregation, and make atonement for them. For wrath has gone out from the Lord, the plague has begun." Then Aaron took it as Moses commanded, and ran into the midst of the assembly, and already the plague had begun among the people. So he put in the incense and made atonement for the people. And he stood between the dead and the living, so the plague was stopped. Now those who died in the plague were 14,700, besides those who died in the Korah incident. So Aaron returned to Moses at the door of the tabernacle of meeting, for the plague had stopped.
Very good. Several things here. Amazing. Children of Israel come back. Look at verse 41. The next day, so the next day you think, surely, you wake up the next day after all this. But on the next day, all the congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled. What did they do? Who did they grumble against? I would have been scared to death to be grumbling against Moses. But what are they saying to Moses? Now, this is the deception of sin. Yeah, it's all your fault. Wait a minute. Who killed the people of the Lord? Well, Moses, it's your fault. Moses, you killed the people of the Lord. But Moses said, if it happens in this way, then who's doing it? The Lord. This is obvious that the Lord did this. Well, maybe the Lord got upset because Moses got upset. No, the Lord did this. So it's like it just shows you the stubbornness of sin against all rationale and all logic, because they're thinking emotionally. They're not thinking reasonably. This is not hard to figure out. Okay, but then something else that is just such a dramatic scene to me when you come and this is going on. So he says, "Get away from this congregation." Moses and Aaron did exactly what God said, but what had already begun to be spread? The plague, which was God's wrath. This is an interesting scene. So very dramatic. So here, just imagine in your mind. So Aaron, this is what God told him. Aaron grabs a censer and a handful of incense. This is an urgent thing right now. He's trying to save, with all that they've done to Moses and Aaron, he's trying to save as many as he possibly can. It's already spreading, which they deserve. He runs to the altar. He scoops up the live coals. He turns and runs into the assembly's presence. He hardly stops before throwing the incense of coals to make a fragrant cloud rise to the Lord like this sweet-smelling savor. He's doing everything he can immediately. Time is essential. 14,700 die. But I want you to think about what that illustrates about us sharing the gospel of Christ with those who are lost. Do we have that kind of sense of urgency, knowing they are dying spiritually? They are dead spiritually. They need the gospel, and the plague of sin is on them. And if Christ comes back and they're in this condition, they have no hope. Can you imagine in Aaron's mind? I think he's trying to save as many people as he can and do what God said. And that was a sweet-smelling savor before the Lord in contrast to this plague. And maybe we could learn from that. We'll stop right there. Thank you.